It doesn't begin with discipline. It doesn't begin with choice. It begins with a pause. That moment when the body no longer demands, when it no longer pulls toward craving or consumption, that moment the silence begins. And in that silence, something ancient stirs. This isn't poetic exaggeration. It's a truth Carl Jung understood deeply, that the soul speaks most clearly when the surface has stilled. And nothing stills the surface quite like abstinence. Not just sexual abstinence. Not just refraining from physical touch or stimulation, but a total withdrawal of body-driven reaction, a full retreat from noise speed, desire not as suppression, but as sacred space. Most people associate abstinence with punishment, deprivation, rules, shame. But in Jungian psychology, the body is not your enemy, and neither is desire. The body is a gateway, a vessel, a symbol. And when it goes quiet, it doesn't die. It listens, it opens. Think about the world we live in, overstimulated, hyperconnected, addicted to urgency. Touch becomes transaction. Intimacy becomes a shortcut. Pleasure becomes numbing. And yet what happens when all of that just stops? Suddenly the body doesn't know what to do. And that's when the soul begins to whisper. In Jung's language, what rises in that moment is the unconscious, the parts of us we've repressed, buried, denied. When we stop distracting the body, these deeper voices begin to emerge in dreams, symbols, spontaneous emotion, intuitive knowing. That ache you feel after a long period of abstinence, that unexpected dream about someone from your past, that sadness that shows up for no clear reason, that's not failure, that's the soul speaking. Because when the physical retreats, the psychic takes over. The more you silence the body's habitual urges, the louder the hidden self begins to emerge. Jung believed the unconscious wasn't just a repository of trauma, but a reservoir of truth. A truth we often can't access because we're too distracted, too stimulated, too consumed. Abstinence then becomes more than control. It becomes a doorway. Not everyone finds this doorway willingly. Some are forced into it: heartbreak, celibacy, illness, loss, grief. Others choose it instinctively, sensing that what they crave on the outside is actually missing on the inside. Either way, something happens when the body surrenders its grip on pleasure. It begins to grieve, not the absence of sensation, but the absence of connection. The realization that for so long the body was used as a substitute for intimacy, instead of a response to it. That's when the real work begins. The slow, quiet work of facing yourself without distraction. And that is terrifying for most, because in the absence of stimulation, we meet sensation, raw, unfiltered, unnumbed. Jung wrote, people will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own soul. And yet it is in this sacred stillness, when the body steps aside, that the soul finally has space to speak. It speaks in symbols. It speaks through memory. It speaks through silence. You don't need to interpret it right away. You don't need to understand. You only need to stay with it, to let the silence deepen. Because if you go far enough into that stillness, you'll start to feel something you haven't felt in years yourself. Not the self you perform, not the self you try to become, but the self that has been patiently waiting beneath the noise. This isn't a spiritual bypass, it's a spiritual return. To the body, yes, but not for pleasure, for presence. So what happens next? What does the silence begin to reveal? And how can abstinence, often misunderstood, often feared, become a map towards something more whole? We'll explore that next. But remember this: when the body goes silent, the soul doesn't whisper, it remembers. And in that remembering, you begin to come home. Abstinence is not about saying no. It's about asking why you wanted to say yes in the first place. Why do you reach? Why do you crave? Why do you feel incomplete until someone touches you, desires you, confirms you? To Carl Jung, every behavior carries symbolic meaning. We're never just attracted to a person. We're never just hungry for touch. Beneath the surface, we're enacting a drama from the unconscious, a story we've been cast into long before we understood the script. This is why abstinence is not about morality. It's about meaning. It's not a rule. It's a reveal. When you stop indulging, when you pause that endless loop of reaching, reacting, releasing, you start to see the patterns, the archetypes, the shadows, the real reasons behind your desire. You start to realize I wasn't seeking sex, I was seeking validation. I wasn't hungry for touch, I was starving for intimacy. I didn't want them. I wanted to escape me. And that's the moment abstinence becomes initiation. Because suddenly you're no longer in control of your urges. You're watching them, studying them, dialoguing with them. This is what Jung called active imagination, when we begin to consciously engage the unconscious instead of letting it run our lives from the shadows. Imagine this: you're practicing abstinence, and instead of suppressing your longing, you start listening to it. Where is it in your body? What images rise with it? Does it feel warm or hollow? Is it about a person or a memory? Is it about love or power? Suddenly, abstinence becomes alchemy. You take raw instinct and turn it into inner information. You start to see how much of your desire is actually compensation for wounds, losses, roles you were forced into. You realize how often you've mistaken attraction for attachment, passion for pain, repetition, arousal for avoidance. And it humbles you, not with shame, but with awareness, that maybe what you've been calling freedom was actually repetition. And maybe what you feared as limitation, abstinence, was actually the beginning of freedom. You begin to notice how silence in the body amplifies the voice of your deeper self. You become aware of your emotional hunger, not just physical. You realize that craving is not the enemy, but a compass. And suddenly you're not fighting yourself. You're discovering yourself. Because at the root of it, abstinence reveals a deeper truth. You are not what you desire. You are what's beneath that desire. You are the soul behind the skin, the consciousness behind the craving, the child behind the chase. And when you stop giving the body what it always expects, it begins to listen to the soul it forgot was there. Jung saw abstinence not as denial but as ritual, not repression but reverence, a way to let the psyche reintegrate, to come back into relationship with parts of the self we've long pushed aside in favor of sensation. Because sometimes the body screams not because it's hungry, but because it's lonely. And sometimes what it needs isn't touch, it's truth. And that truth only arrives in the silence. Desire is not the enemy, but the way we avoid it often is. What we call craving on the surface is rarely just physical. Beneath it lies something deeper, darker, older. Carl Jung called it the shadow, the part of the psyche we reject, deny, disown. And here's the painful truth. Most of our desires don't come from the soul. They come from the shadow trying to speak through the body. You think you're longing for connection, but you might be reenacting abandonment. You think you're chasing love, but you might be chasing the parent who never fully saw you. You think it's attraction, but it might be unprocessed grief, disguised as lust. That's the uncomfortable mirror abstinence holds up. It doesn't just quiet the body, it confronts the story behind your need. And the story often isn't pretty. You stop touching, you stop escaping. And suddenly, the silence floods in, filled with voices you tried to forget. Unworthiness, fear of rejection, shame around your own needs, memories that still live in your nervous system. This is the confrontation Jung warned us about. The unconscious will rise whether we're ready or not. And when the body goes still, there's nothing left to hide behind. The shadow doesn't show up like a monster. It shows up like a memory, like a pattern you swore you broke but somehow keep repeating, like a desire that feels bigger than you and yet empty. Abstinence shines a light on that darkness, not to shame you, but to show you where the pain really lives. And often, it lives in our unmet needs, the ones we were too proud, too scared, or too conditioned to speak out loud. So we try to feel better. We seek bodies not because we want sex, but because we want softness. We want to be held, known, wanted. But the body only knows how to ask for what the soul was never taught to articulate. And when you take abstinence seriously as a spiritual or psychological practice, you begin to ask new questions. What am I really craving? Whose attention am I actually trying to earn? What part of me still believes I must give myself away to be loved? This is where abstinence becomes transformation, because it's no longer about saying no to others. It's about finally saying yes to the part of yourself that's been silently waiting. The little girl who never felt safe, the little boy who thought love had to be earned, the teenager who mistook attention for affection, the adult who turned pain into patterns. just to feel alive. Jung said, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. Abstinence makes the unconscious conscious. It shows you the exact moment when the urge appears and gives you the power to sit with it, instead of act it out. And in that space between urge and action, you meet your shadow, face to face, not to fight it, but to understand it, to see that your desires are not shameful but misdirected, that they are not too much, they were simply never met with enough care, enough honesty, enough awareness. And now in this silence, you offer them that care. You stop being reactive, you become reflective, and slowly, you reclaim power. Not over your body, but over the stories that have controlled it. You stop projecting your unmet needs onto others. You stop leaking your energy through constant seeking. You stop confusing chemistry with compatibility, intensity with intimacy. You begin to see, truly deeply see. And that is the most powerful part of abstinence. It forces you to finally stop lying to yourself. Not all hunger is for food. Not all desire is sexual. And not all craving is about what you want, but what you were never taught to hold inside yourself. This is where abstinence becomes emotional intelligence. Because once the impulse is no longer acted upon, once you pause instead of pursue, you begin to notice something subtle yet profound. You're not just fighting urges. You're listening to a language you were never taught to read. You feel the need rising in your body and your chest, maybe even in your skin. But instead of reacting, you ask, what is this feeling really asking of me? And often the answer isn't touch. It's truth. It's tenderness. It's help me hold what I'm afraid to name. Carl Jung believed that emotions are not random. They are messengers, symbolic forces carrying meaning from the unconscious to the conscious. And desire, it's one of the loudest messengers we have. But most of us never learned how to listen. We were taught to act quickly, swipe, text, flirt, escape. So we spend our energy instead of studying it. We chase not to connect, but to quiet the noise inside. And this is where craving becomes dangerous, not because it's wrong, but because it can drown out the real calling. The body says, I need release. The soul whispers, I need repair. The body says, I'm starving. The soul asks for what you never got as a child. When you slow down, when you abstain, you begin to realize that most of your cravings were never about pleasure. They were about proof. Proof that you're still desirable. Proof that you're still lovable. Proof that someone still wants you. But what if your worth didn't need proof anymore? What if instead of craving attention, you answered the call of your own unmet presence? This is emotional alchemy. This is self-reparenting. This is soul literacy, where you sit with discomfort long enough to decode its origin and realize that you are capable of holding yourself in ways no other person ever did. This is not denial, it's devotion, not to rules, not to repression, but to the reconnection with your most grounded self. Abstinence, when practiced with consciousness, becomes a daily act of emotional discernment. Is this a craving, or is this a calling? Is this about escape, or about expression? Is this my desire, or my distraction? And slowly your inner world begins to shift. You become more sensitive, not less. More aware, not colder. More discerning, not distant. And one day someone touches you, and you don't just feel attraction, you feel your boundaries. One day someone flirts with you, and instead of collapsing into their energy, you feel your center, because abstinence didn't numb you. It refined you. And now you're not pulled toward intensity. You're drawn to integrity. You don't crave touch for validation. You allow it when it matches the frequency of your own self-respect. You're no longer hungry. You're home. That's the emotional intelligence of restraint. Not no from fear, but not yet from wisdom. Not I can't. But I choose not to because I finally understand what I'm actually seeking. The body remembers everything the mind forgets. It stores what the ego denies. It reveals what the voice cannot speak. And when you stop using the body to run from pain, it starts guiding you toward it. This is the paradox most never realize. When you silence the body, you don't lose connection to yourself. You begin hearing yourself more clearly than ever. Carl Jung believed that the unconscious mind doesn't just hide in dreams, it lives in the body. In every tight muscle, every knot in your stomach, every ache in your chest, there is a message, a memory, a meaning waiting to be decoded. But we numb it. We override it. We assume desire is random urges or biological and tension is just stress. But what if every single bodily sensation was a portal, a doorway into truth? When you stop indulging, the body doesn't shut down, it starts to speak. Not in words, but in waves, in pulses, in sudden tears, in restless nights, in unexpected stillness. These are not problems to solve, they are soul signals. Abstinence, real conscious abstinence, reawakens your sensitivity to this inner language. Suddenly you notice where desire sits, where pain lives, where your longing lands. And it's no longer random, it's relational. The ache in your chest, that might be grief finally surfacing after years of distraction. The flutter in your gut when someone looks at you, that might be your body saying, "This is familiar, but not safe." The silence in your skin, that might be your soul whispering, "It's okay to wait until it's real." You begin to notice how the body doesn't just react, it remembers. Every unmet need, every unsaid truth, every time you betrayed your own intuition just to be chosen. Jung said, the soul would have no rainbow if the eyes had no tears. Likewise, the soul would have no voice if the body had no silence. When the noise stops, when the touch stops, when the external feedback fades, you begin to realize the body isn't separate from the soul. It's a speaker system, and it's been transmitting your inner truth all along. You just weren't still enough to listen, and now through abstinence you are. You don't need to overanalyze every sensation. You don't need to spiritualize every tension. You just need to respect what arises. Because when the body is no longer used for transaction, performance, or validation, it becomes a temple again, a place where sacred messages arrive, where intuition meets sensation, where the soul says through the body, you are safe now. You don't have to keep running. You can rest. You can feel. You can listen. That's the gift abstinence gives you. Not emptiness, but access. Not boredom, but embodiment. Not loss, but language. Because the soul doesn't just speak in symbols, it speaks in sensations. And every time you choose to stay with what arises, without numbing, chasing, or reacting, you reclaim your power. Not as a concept, but as a lived, embodied, breath-by-breath reality. Abstinence begins as withholding, but somewhere along the path, it becomes devotion. What started as a choice, or maybe even a necessity, slowly shifts. It no longer feels like sacrifice. It begins to feel like sovereignty, like sacredness, like home. Because when you've gone long enough without filling the void, you begin to realize the void was never meant to be filled. It was meant to be felt. And in that feeling, in that willingness to sit with yourself raw and unguarded, something sacred begins to rise. Carl Jung believed that individuation, the journey towards psychological wholeness, always includes a withdrawal, a turning inward, a shedding of the external identities that no longer serve who you're becoming. Abstinence, then, is not just an act of restraint. It's a ritual of return. Return to the body not as object but as oracle. Return to the soul not as concept but as compass. Return to your energy not as currency but as ceremony. This is when abstinence becomes a spiritual path. Not because you're denying yourself, but because you're dedicating yourself to healing, to clarity, to alignment. You begin to feel the sacredness of being untouched, not as isolation, but as intimacy with yourself. You don't give it up out of guilt. You offer it out of reverence, for your energy, for your truth, for the quiet wisdom that only arises in stillness. And slowly the old questions begin to fade. Why am I alone? Why isn't anyone choosing me? Will I ever be loved again? Because they are replaced by new questions. Do I love being with myself? Is this energy I'm holding holy? What kind of love would honor this version of me? In this sacred space, you stop waiting for someone to come complete you. You realize you were never incomplete. You were just scattered, exhausted, leaking your energy into places that couldn't hold your depth. Now, you hold it. Now, you protect it. Now, you guard your silence the way temples guard sacred fire, because you know what it cost you to come back to yourself. Jung would say that the sacred is often found not in the ecstatic, but in the withdrawn. Not in the noise, but in the gap between impulses. It is there in the stillness between desire and reaction that the divine meets the human. And that is the deepest form of abstinence, not absence, but alignment. You no longer abstain out of fear. You abstain out of freedom. You are no longer avoiding life. You are listening to the parts of life most people never slow down long enough to hear. The rustle of intuition, the breath of your own peace, the clarity that comes when you stop chasing and start receiving. And when or if you choose to share your body again, it will not be from hunger. It will be from overflow. Not to be filled, but to offer fullness. Because now your love is not conditional, not reactive, not bargaining for attention. Your love has become a sacred current, and only those who swim in still waters will ever reach it. You are no longer chasing. You are no longer withholding. You are simply whole. There comes a point in the path where abstinence dissolves, not because you've given up on it, but because you've outgrown the need to protect yourself from your own desire. You no longer fear your craving. You no longer worship it either. You understand it. This is what Carl Jung called integration, when the unconscious has been made conscious, when the shadow is no longer your enemy, when desire, discipline, and identity sit at the same table and no one is excluded. This is where wholeness begins, because you're no longer trying to become someone. You are simply allowing all the parts of you to finally belong. The one who used to chase love, she belongs. The one who used touch to feel real, he belongs. The one who felt ashamed for wanting, she belongs too. And now, so does the one who can sit in silence, who can say no from clarity or yes from truth, not from fear, not from loneliness, but from a place of deep knowing I am already full. You no longer use abstinence to escape desire. You use desire to reveal where your energy wants to flow with wisdom, not reaction. You begin to feel the full spectrum of your humanity, soft and strong, hungry and whole, sensual and sacred. You stop fragmenting yourself between the pure one and the passionate one. You realize they were never separate, only separated by fear. Now, you've returned to your body, to your heart, to yourself. And that self is not perfect, but it is present. Carl Jung once said, wholeness is not achieved by cutting off a portion of one's being, but by integration. You no longer need to punish your desire. You just need to understand its purpose. You no longer need to cling to abstinence as identity. You now see it as a season, a sacred teacher, a bridge that helped you return home. And now that you've crossed the bridge, you walk with a different rhythm. You no longer perform. You no longer please. You no longer seek proof. You offer presence. And anyone who meets you now doesn't just meet your body. They meet your wholeness, the stillness, the strength, the integration of fire and silence. You are no longer afraid of being touched because you know no one can reach you unless they've learned to sit in the silence where your soul now lives. That's the truth behind abstinence. It was never about saying no. It was about becoming someone who doesn't need to say anything at all because your energy already speaks the truth.